Some time before my coronation, said the emperor, the Pope wished to see me and made it a point to visit me himself. He had made many concessions. He'd come to Paris for the purpose of crowning me. He consented not to place the crown on my head. He dispensed with the ceremony of the public communion. He had, therefore, in his opinion, many compensations to expect in return. He had accordingly at first dreamt of Romagna and the legations, and he began to suspect that he should be obliged to give up all that. He then lowered his pretensions to a very trifling favor, as he called it, my signature to an ancient document, a worn-out rag, which he held from Louis XIV. Do me that favor, said he. In fact, it signifies nothing. Cheerfully, most holy Father, and the thing is done, if it is feasible. It was, however, a declaration in which Louis XIV, at the close of his life, seduced by Madame de Maintenon, or prevailed upon by his confessors, expressed his disapprobation of the celebrated articles of the 1682, the foundations of the liberties of the Gallican Church. The emperor shrewdly replied that he had not, for his own part, any personal objection, but it was requisite for him, as a matter of form, to speak to the bishops about it, on which the Pope repeatedly observed that such a communication was by no means necessary, and that the thing did not deserve to make so much noise. I shall never, he remarked, show the signature. It shall be kept as secret as that of Louis XIV. But if it signifies nothing, said Napoleon, what use is there for my signature? And if any signification can be drawn from it, I am bound by a sense of propriety to consult my doctors, with the view, however, of avoiding the imputation of a constant refusal of every request. The emperor wished to seem rather inclined to grant the favor. The Bishop of Nantes and the other bishops, who were really French, came to me in great haste. They were furious and watched me, said the emperor, as they would have watched Louis XIV on his deathbed to prevent him from turning Protestant. The Sulpicians were called in. They were Jesuits. Oh, petit pied of little feet. They strove to find out my intention. Were ready to do whatever I wished. The emperor concluded with observing, the Pope had dispensed with the public communion in my favor, and it is by his determination in that respect that I form my opinion of the sincerity of his religious belief. He had held a congregation of cardinals for the purpose of settling the ceremonial. The greater number warmly insisted upon my taking the communion in public, asserting the great influence of the example on their people and the necessity of my holding it out. The Pope, on the contrary, fearful lest I should fulfill that duty as if I were going through one of the articles of M. de Segur's program, looked upon it as a sacrilege and was inflexible in opposing it. Napoleon, he observed, is not perhaps a believer. The time will no doubt come in which his faith will be established, and in the meantime, let us not burden his conscience or our own in his Christian charity, for he really is a worthy, mild, and excellent man. He never once despaired of seeing me a penitent at his tribunal. He has often let his hopes and thoughts on that subject escape him. We sometimes conversed about it in a pleasant and friendly manner. It will happen to you sooner or later, said he, with an innocent tenderness of expression. You will be converted by me or by others, and you will then feel how great the content, the satisfaction of your own heart. In the meantime, my influence over him was such that I drew from him by the mere power of my conversation that famous Concordat of Fontainebleau, in which he renounced the temporal sovereignty and act on account of which he has since shown that he dreaded the judgment of posterity, or rather the reprobation of his successors. He had no sooner signed than he felt the stings of repentance. He was to have died the following day with me in public, but at night he was, or pretended to be, ill. The truth is that immediately after I left him, he again fell into the hands of his habitual advisers, who drew a terrible picture of the error he had committed. Had we been left by ourselves, I might have done what I pleased with him. I should have governed the religious with the same facility that I did the political world. He was in truth a lamb, a good man in every respect, a man of real worth, whom I esteemed and loved greatly, and who on his part is, I am convinced, not altogether destitute of interest with regard to me. You will not see him make any severe complaints against me, nor prefer in particular any direct and personal accusation against me, no more than the other sovereigns. There may perhaps be some vague and vulgar declamations against ambition and bad faith, but nothing positive and direct, because statesmen are well aware that when the hour of libels is past, no one would be allowed to prefer a public accusation without corroborative proofs, and they have none of these to produce. Such will be the province of history. On the other hand, there will be at most but some wretched chroniclers, shallow enough to take the ravings of clubs or intrigues for authentic facts, or some writers of memoirs who, deceived by the errors of the moment, will be dead before they are able to correct their mistakes. When the real particulars of my disputes with the Pope shall be made public, the world will be surprised at the extent of my patience, for it is known that I was not of a very enduring temper. When he left me after my coronation, he felt a secret disgust at not having obtained the compensations he thought he had deserved. But however grateful I might have been in other respects, I could not, after all, make a traffic of the interests of the empire by way of acquitting my own obligations, and I was besides too proud to exhibit a seeming acknowledgment that I had purchased his kindnesses. He had hardly set his foot on the soil of Italy when the intriguers and mischief makers, the enemies of France, took advantage of the disposition he was in to govern his conduct, and from that instant everything was hostile on his part. He no longer was the gentle, the peaceable Chiaramonti, that worthy bishop of Imola, who had at so early a period shown himself worthy of the enlightened state of the century. His signature was thenceforth affixed to acts only which characterized the Gregories and the Bonifaces more than him. Rome became the focus of all the plots hatched against us. I strove in vain to bring him back by the force of reason, but I found it impossible to ascertain his sentiments. Our wrongs became so serious, and the insults offered us were so ostensible, that I was imperiously called upon to act in my turn. I therefore seized upon his fortresses. I took possession of some provinces, and I finished by occupying Rome itself, at the same time declaring and strictly observing that I held him sacred in his spiritual capacity, which was far from being satisfactory to him. A crisis, however, presented itself. It was believed that fortune had abandoned me at Essling, and measures were in immediate readiness for exciting the population of that great capital to insurrection. The officer who commanded there thought that he could escape the danger only by getting rid of the Pope, whom he sent forward on his journey to France. That measure was carried into effect without my orders, and was evident in direct opposition to my views. I dispatched instant orders for stopping the Pope wherever he might be met with, and he was kept at Savona, where he was treated with every possible care and attention, for I wished to make myself feared, but not to ill-treat him, to bend him to my views, not to degrade him. I entered very different projects. The removal served only to inflame the spirit of resentment and intrigue. Until then, the quarrel had been but temporal. The Pope's advisors, in the hope of reestablishing their affairs, involved in it all the jumble of spirituality. I then found it necessary to carry on the contest with him on that head. I had my council of conscience, my ecclesiastical councils, and I invested my imperial courts with the power of deciding in cases of appeal from abuses. For my soldiers could be of no further use in all this. I felt it necessary to fight the Pope with his own weapons, to his men of erudition, to his sophists, his civilians, and his scribes. It was incumbent upon me to oppose mine. An English plot was laid to carry him off from Savona. It was of service to me. I caused him to be removed to Fontainebleau, but that was to be the period of his sufferings and the regeneration of his splendor. All my grand views were accomplished in disguise and mystery. I had brought things to such a point as to render the development infallible without any exertion, and in a way altogether natural. It was accordingly consecrated by the Pope in the famous Concordat of Fontainebleau, in spite even of my disasters at Moscow. What then would have been the result? Had I returned victorious and triumphant, I had consequently obtained the separation which was so desirable of the spiritual from the temporal, which is so injurious to his holiness, and the commixture of which produces disorder in society in the name and by the hands of him who ought himself to be the center of harmony. And from that time I intended to exalt the Pope beyond measure, to surround him with grandeur and honors. I should have succeeded in suppressing all his anxiety for the loss of his temporal power. I should have made an idol of him. He would have remained near my person. Paris would have become the capital of Christendom, and I should have governed the religious as well as the political world. It was an additional means of binding tighter all the federative parts of the empire and of preserving the tranquility of everything placed without it. I should have had my religious as well as my legislative sessions. My councils would have constituted the representation of Christianity, and the popes would have only been the presidents. I should have called together and dissolved those assemblies, approved and published their discussions as Constantine and Charlemagne had done. If that supremacy had escaped the emperors, it was because they had committed the fault of letting the spiritual heads reside at a remote distance from them, who took advantage of the weakness of the princes or of the critical events to shake off their dependence and enslave them in their turn. But, resumed the emperor, to accomplish that object, I had found it requisite to maneuver with a great deal of dexterity, above all to conceal my real way of thinking, to give a direction altogether different to general opinion, and to feed the public with vulgar trifles for the purpose of more effectually concealing the importance and depth of my secret design. I accordingly experienced a kind of satisfaction in finding myself accused of barbarity towards the Pope, and of tyranny in religious matters. Foreigners in particular promoted my wishes in this respect by filling their wretched libels with invectives against my pitiful ambition, which according to them had driven me to devour the miserable patrimony of St. Peter. But I was perfectly aware that public opinion would again declare itself in my favorite home, and that no means could exist abroad for disconcerting my plan. What measures would not have been employed for its prevention had it been anticipated at a seasonable period? For how vast is its future ascendancy over all the Catholic countries, and how great is its influence even upon those that are not so, by the cooperation of the members of that religion who are spread throughout these countries. The emperor said that this deliverance from the court of Rome, this legal union, the control of religion in the hands of the sovereign, had been for a long time the constant object of his meditations and his wishes. England, Russia, the northern crowns, and part of Germany are, he said, in possession of it. Venice and Naples had enjoyed it. No government can be carried on without it. A nation is otherwise very instant, affected in its tranquility, its dignity, its independence, but the task he added was very difficult. At every step I was alive to the danger. I was induced to think that once engaged in it I should be abandoned by the nation. I more than once sounded and strove to elicit public opinion, but in vain, and I have been enabled to convince myself that I never should have had the national cooperation, and this explains the sally which I had witnessed. The emperor, perceiving at one of those grand Sunday audiences, which were very numerously attended, the Archbishop of Tours de Berbel, addressed him in a very elevated tone. "Well, your grace, how do our affairs with the Pope go on?" "Sire, the deputation of your bishops is about to set out for Savona." "Very well. Endeavor to make the Pope listen to reason. Prevail upon him to conduct himself with prudence. Otherwise, the consequences will be unpleasant. Tell him plainly that he is no longer in the times of the Gregories, and that I am not debonair." He has the example of Henry VIII. And without his wickedness, I possess more strength and power than he had. Let him know that whatever part I may take, I have 600,000 Frenchmen in arms who, in every contingency, will march with before me. And as myself, the peasantry and mechanics look to me alone and repose unlimited confidence in me. The prudent and enlightened part of the intermediate class, those who take care of their interest and wish for tranquility, will follow me. The only class favorable to him will be the meddling and talkative, who will forget him at the end of 10 days to chat upon some fresh subject. And as the archbishop, who betrayed his embarrassment by his cowardice, was about to stammer out some words, the emperor added in a very softened tone, "You are unacquainted with all this. I participate in your doctrines. I honor your piety. I respect your character." The emperor, I now understand him perfectly, had no doubt merely thrown out those observations in order that we might give effect to them in other places. But he deceived himself with respect to our dispositions, or at least to those of the palace. Some at least reflecting part were decided and loud in censuring his conduct on these occasions. Others, with the best intentions, were extremely cautious not to let a word of it transpire, lest it should prove injurious to him in the public opinion. For such was in general our misconception, our singular manner of understanding and explaining the emperor's meaning, that although without any bad design and solely through levity and coherency or for fashion's sake, instead of making him popular, we were perhaps the very persons who did him most injury. I very well remember that the morning when the famous concordant of Fontainebleau unexpectedly appeared in the Moniteur, and some persons confidentially assured each other, in the saloons of St. Cloud, that nothing was less authentic than that document, and that it was a base fabrication. Others whispered that it was no doubt genuine in the main points, but that it had been extracted from the Pope by the Emperor's anger and violence. And this was so well described that I should not be surprised were the happy dramatic episode of Napoleon at Fontainebleau, dragging the father of the faithful by his white hair, not supplied by the imagination of the poetical proser who wrote it, but caught up from the mouths of the courtiers and even the emperor's servants themselves. Yet this is the way that history is written. The 18th, the weather was most dreadful during the whole of the night and day. About 3 o'clock, the emperor took advantage of its clearing up a little and went out. He came to my apartment, and we called on General Gourgaud, who was indisposed. We then visited Madame de Monttalon, who followed us to the garden. The emperor was in excellent spirits, which enlivened the conversation. He undertook to persuade Madame de Monttalon to make a general confession, particularly insisting upon her setting out with her first sin. "Come," said he, "speak without apprehension. Do not let our neighbor constrain you. Consider him merely as your confessor. We shall forget it all in a quarter of an hour afterwards." And I really believe he would have succeeded in persuading her when the governor fortunately came to interrupt so pleasant a scene. He made his appearance, and the emperor, to avoid receiving him, hastily took a shelter in the bottom of the wood. We were joined in a few instants by Monsieur de Monttalon, who acquainted the emperor that the governor and the admiral earnestly requested the honor of speaking with him. He thought that some communication was to be made on their part, and returned to the garden, where he received them. We remained behind with the governor's officers. The conversation soon became animated on the part of the emperor, who, as he walked between the governor and the admiral, almost uniformly addressed himself to the latter, and when he spoke to the former, we continued at too great a distance to hear anything distinctly. But I have since learned that he again repeated, and with perhaps more energy and warmth, all that he'd said to him in the preceding conversation. A consequence of favorable explanations which the admiral, who acted the part of mediator, labored to give of the governor's intentions. The emperor observed that the faults of Monsieur Lowe proceed from his habits of life. He has never had the command of any but foreign deserters, of Piedmontese, Corsicans, and Sicilians, all renegados and traitors to their country, the dregs and scum of Europe. If he had commanded Englishmen, if he were one himself, he would show respect to those who have a right to be honored. In another instance, the emperor declared that there was a moral courage as necessary as courage on the field of battle, that Mr. Lowe did not exercise it here with regard to us. and dreaming only of our escape, rather than employing the only real, prudent, reasonable, and sensible means for preventing it. The emperor also told him that although his body was in the hands of evil-minded men, his soul was as lofty and independent as when at the head of 400,000 men, or on the throne when he disposed of kingdoms. To the article respecting the reduction of our expenses and the money which was asked of the emperor, he answered, "All those details are very painful to me. They are mean. You might place me on the burning pile of Montezuma or Katamozin without extracting from me gold, which I do not possess. Besides, who asks you for anything? Who entreats you to feed me? When you discontinue your supply of provisions, those brave soldiers who you see there pointing with his hand in the camp of the 53rd will take pity on me. I shall go place myself at the grenadiers' table, and they will not. I am confident. Drive away the first, the oldest soldier in Europe." The emperor, having reproached the governor with having kept some books which were addressed to him, he answered that he had done so in consequence of their having been sent under the address of emperor. "And who," replied the emperor with emotion, "gave you the right of disputing that title? In so few years, your Lord Castlereagh, your Lord Bathurst, and all the others, and you who speak to me, will be buried in the dust of oblivion. Or if your names will be remembered, it will be only on account of the indignity with which you have treated me, while the Emperor Napoleon shall doubtless continue forever the subject, the ornament of history, and the star of civilized nations. Your libels are of no avail against me. You have expended millions on them. What have they produced? Truth pierces through the clouds. It shines like the sun, and like it, it is imperishable."